Hi, folks. Thanks for tuning in for another philosophical exploration. For today's exploration, we're going to continue on with where we left off regarding the meditation upon death we were reflecting on and exploring in our previous conversation. And we were looking at what some of the ancient philosophers had to say about what the meditation upon death involves, and each philosopher's views on that matter. And we looked at Pythagoras in particular and Socrates, and we allotted more discussion time to Socrates, given that, in my view, he seems to be the first philosopher within the Western philosophical canon who really brings the meditation upon death as a way of philosophizing into a more fully developed expression. And so I think it's therefore worthwhile to meditate upon his meditation at some length. And that can provide us with perhaps some food for thought for our own philosophizing and meditating upon death. And where we left off was we were examining what I've formulated as one of the core propositions within Plato's Apology, where Socrates converses and meditates upon death at some length. And that proposition that I formulated was stated as follows: the fear of death is born of ignorance, not wisdom. So we talked about that at some length, and we tried to get at what the gist of that proposition means and what it implies about how it is we should meditate upon our death, how we should think about death and dying, and how we should maybe use this meditation as a daily practice in order to lead a more healthful life, and to be better off overall, insofar as death is something that might cause us distress by thinking about it. If we can think about it in the proper way, perhaps we can be better adapted to handle its reality and its inevitability. So on that note, I thought we would shift to the second proposition. And the second proposition that I've formulated here, based upon another key passage within the Apology, is as follows: it is not difficult to avoid death when one's life is threatened, insofar as it is within one's locus of control to do so. But it is difficult to avoid the moral contagion of human vice, which spreads much more quickly than death. So let me just briefly recite the passage from the Apology in which Socrates talks about this proposition in somewhat different terms. And then I thought we could reflect upon the passage and try to get at what it means and what it implies about meditating upon death, and perhaps whether or not we think that and reflect on whether we think it's perhaps a good practical advice that Socrates is giving or not. So I'll just begin by quoting that passage. Neither I nor any other man should, on trial or in war, contrive to avoid death at any cost. Indeed, it is often obvious in battle that one could escape death by throwing away one's weapons and by turning to supplicate one's pursuers. And there are many ways to avoid death in every kind of danger, if one will venture to do or say anything to avoid it. It is not difficult to avoid death, gentlemen, and Socrates is addressing the men who are putting him on trial. The prosecutors, and he's addressing the jury perhaps as well. And so he says, it's not difficult to avoid death, gentlemen, It is much more difficult to avoid wickedness, for it runs faster than death. Slow and elderly as I am, I have been caught by the slower pursuer, whereas my accusers, being clever and sharp, have been caught by the quicker wickedness. I leave you now, condemned to death by you, but they are condemned by truth to wickedness and injustice. So I maintain my assessment, and they maintain theirs. This perhaps had to happen, and I think it is as it should be. So I think a lot is going on in this passage. Let me just briefly offer my reflections, what my takeaways were from reading this passage. So Socrates is making the point that in certain situations, those in which we have a degree of control, we can avoid death. So Socrates talks about, for example, the soldier escaping death in a battle by throwing away his weapons and supplicating his adversaries. But we can think of maybe more everyday examples like looking both ways before crossing the street to avoid getting hit by a car. Now, Socrates is also suggesting that human vice, for example, wickedness, can develop more rapidly than death does. And he suggests that partaking of wicked actions can cause the vice of what I call moral contagion to rapidly grow and progress much more quickly than does the progress toward death. And I think this passage gets at some of the ethical questions, Ryan, that we've been addressing over the course of our previous conversation. And one of these is that is raised here is this question of what is the appropriate attitude toward death? And the appropriate attitude in the context of this passage is that insofar as it is within one's locus of control, one can avoid dying in certain situations in which one's life is threatened. And then another ethical question, which I think this passage raises, is how should one conduct oneself in regards to the reality of one's death? So I think this passage contains some practical wisdom, which might be stated as a precept such as avoid dying in situations in which it is within one's control to do so, or avoid dying in situations in which one has the power to do so. Such precepts may help one to reduce the fear of dying, which is not to say that the fear of death is inherently bad, but that perhaps when the fear is excessive or unrealistic, it may have maladaptive consequences. So that's sort of the wisdom that I extracted from reading the passage. And I think it's a useful piece of wisdom insofar as it is wisdom. I think that if you're mindful of the degree to which you can avoid threats like death, then you should do so. And I think it's also just as important to avoid partaking of actions that can give rise to moral contagion, which I've called this fact of human psychology, which is that engaging in certain actions over and over and over again establishes it as a habit in our mind and in our behavior. And so this, these activities we engage in can be ones that we might consider ones that are primarily vicious in nature. They are deviations from what we might consider to be, moral conduct. We might judge them to be, morally wrong or bad. So, we generally, when we engage in actions that tend towards those things, tend towards actions that perpetuate, violations of certain moral rules, for example, or adverse consequences for others, harm, so on and so forth, or or these actions might just be generally a sign of a trait we find to be despicable in some sense. I think when we engage in vicious behavior, that it's self-perpetuating in much the same way as a disease is, and can perpetuate itself rapidly in that respect. Whereas, the fear of death is something we have a degree of control over, and the reality of death, is not as nearly. We don't arrive at that event of our own death nearly as quickly as we arrive at I suppose, a transgression of our moral nature, or a deviation from the virtuous path. It's far easier to be a bad person, and it's far easier to get there quickly than it is to die. This is what I'm sort of extracting from this passage here. So I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Ryan.
Yeah, I actually really like this passage. There's like so much to it. So for me, when I was reading this, it really stuck out to me, like the first part of the proposition, where he talks about neither I nor any other man should, on trial or on war, contrive to avoid death at any cost. And then he goes on to give those examples of turning in the weapons and supplicating to one's pursuers. So I think here what he's trying to get at is, it's better to have a good death than live sort of like a bad or a wicked existence by, just surrendering and supplicating to one's, enemies or pursuers. So in a way, I see like the moral contagion component as being almost like a response to the fear of death. So like we fear death, and so this will lead us to do certain things that are, morally wicked, or something that's seen as even treasonous or something to our country and to our people. So that's sort of the relationship that I see between death and the moral contagion from this passage. And I think everything else you pretty much hit on. For me, so that's just all I kind of wanted to add to that, was that relationship between like living or having a good death versus, choosing to live, but living sort of like a wicked or corrupt existence.
Right. So I hear you say it's better to die virtuously rather than to live viciously. And that's how I would frame it.
Yeah, like think of Socrates here, like he's trying to live by his morals, his virtues, and what they're asking him to do is basically like the choice is basically die, or like submit to the state and their morality and their laws, or live by your own virtue. And he's refusing to be corrupt by what he sees as the Athenian state, and he's choosing to have a good death rather than live like a wicked and corrupt life.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good insight you have there. I think that's true to the portrayal of Socrates by Plato in Plato's corpus. And what kind of resonated with me too was the the final few sentences here now. I leave you now condemned to death by you, but they are condemned by truth to wickedness and injustice. So I maintain my assessment, and they maintain theirs. This perhaps had to happen, and I think it is as it should be. That final sentence especially, this perhaps had to happen, and I think it is as it should be. There's a certain sort of transcendence, I suppose, of the fact that he's about to die. And there's a transcendence of all sorts of things we commonly associate with that situation, such as fear or trepidation. Socrates seems to be relatively unshaken by the verdict of the jury that he's going to die. And in some sense, I think he's, in this instance, he stands as, as a model for the sage who exhibits self-control and who exhibits a sort of, a ability to regulate one's emotions despite adversity and despite the inevitability of death in this instance. And I can kind of see in this sentence here sort of a anticipation of the Stoic philosophers who formulated similar ideas, namely that, in some sense, this idea of acceptance of one's fate, acceptance of fatal necessity. And I think Socrates seems to be, acquiescing to his fate in this passage here. And I think it's sort of archetypal of many philosophers in this philosophical tradition to be able to, to allow the psyche to prevail over, over just the brute matter of the situation, and so the mind, in some sense, seems to be the ruler and not the slave to the material reality. So that's the light bulb that just went off, but just briefly mention that. So yeah, I don't know if you have any other things to add in there, Ryan, at all.
No, I think your assessment's right there with sort of that attitude towards death and it sort of being almost like a fatalistic view of death, but in some sense, embracing it or at least not letting it bother you. It seems to be a common trend among these sort of, I almost want to call them like mystics. These sort of these key figures. You even look at like Jesus and other religious figures. You see the same sort of trend.
Yeah, you do. That's why I use the word archetypal, because I think in some sense Socrates represents an archetype of a certain sage, and he exhibits those qualities which we commonly ascribe to a sage of his nature, whether it's Jesus or I suppose Buddha. Buddha had a few tricks up his sleeve with respect to controlling and managing his emotions and transcending, as it were. So, and we could go on and on with different philosophers in that respect. Lao Tzu would be another one. Any wise person really, I think, would have to have this capacity. And so for that's something for us to ponder over as we plod on here with proposition 3. And so I've formulated the proposition as follows. The dictates of Socrates' daemon admonishes him that death is a good thing. So again, I'll just briefly go over the passage and then we can briefly go over our reflections and see where those may lead us. So here I go. At all previous times, my familiar prophetic power, and I'll just briefly state what that prophetic power is here. I take, according to my interpretation, this prophetic power to be Socrates' daemon. And a daemon essentially is, it's an ancient Greek term that translates as God or godlike or power or fate. And a daemon is a lesser deity or a guiding spirit, such as those of ancient Greek religion and mythology, and those found in later Hellenistic religion and philosophy. And daemons were also conceived by the ancient Greeks as the souls of men that acted as a tutelary deity. Now, in respect to Socrates here, and Plato's Apology, Socrates claims to have a daemonian, which is another Greek term which just translates as divine something. And this daemonian or daemon, or however we want to put it, frequently warned Socrates in the form of a voice against mistakes, but it never told him what to do. So that was just a brief caveat that I wanted to put out there before I read the rest of the passage, just to give the viewers an understanding of what a daemon is, because of course it's not your everyday type of term, the meaning of it, and it's maybe we might grasp similar concepts within our own culture, or such as our conscience or something, or our voice of reason, this part of us which seems to know what's right, if we want to put it that way. It's the same sort of phenomenon here manifesting for Socrates. So I'll continue on. So, at all previous times, my familiar prophetic power, my spiritual manifestation, frequently opposed me, even in small matters, when I was about to do something wrong. But now that, as you can see for yourselves, I was faced with what one might think and what is generally thought to be the worst of evils, my divine sign has not opposed me, either when I left home at dawn or when I came into court, or at any time that I was about to say something during my speech. Yet in other talks, it often held me back in the middle of my speaking. But now it has opposed no word or deed of mine. What do I think is the reason for this? I will tell you. What has happened to me may well be a good thing, and those of us who believe death to be an evil are certainly mistaken. I have convincing proof of this, for it is impossible that my familiar sign do not oppose me if I was not about to do what was right. So this is a dense passage, and I will offer my own reflections on it, and with the hope of maybe making it clearer and making more sense of it. So in this passage, I think Socrates' daemon here is instructing him that death is a good thing. In modern terms, we might say Socrates' conscience or his reason is instructing him that death is a good thing. Philosophers would seem to agree to this view, Montaigne among one of them, who claimed that there's nothing evil in life for the man who has thoroughly grasped the fact that to be deprived of life is not an evil. And so, the question that has come up for me is, how might death be a good thing? And I'll just leave it at that. I don't have an immediate answer, although maybe something is brooding upstairs in my attic that demands attending to. So I'm curious, Brian, if you have any of your own reflections and insights here regarding what I've gone over, or even just the question of how might death be a good thing. So what do you got?
I'm going to stick with just sort of what Epicurus might say about this. He seems to be a bit more agnostic on this front, so I don't think he would really say that it's a good or a bad thing. He would just simply say that we can't know. We can't know whether or not it's a good or bad thing, simply because anything that's good or bad or evil or whatever, it only happens within our sensory experience. So once we're dead, that's by definition for Epicurus, it means it's an end to our sensory life. So yeah, he would just sort of, you would kind of reject or push back on this a bit. I think everyone's intuition is to maybe push on or push back on that one a bit, like that death is a good thing. I think it's instinctually not a good thing for us, but I can still see where Socrates is coming from, especially in his situation, what he's dying for. I think if you find yourself in a circumstance like this, that's, at the core of your morality or at the core of your ethical being, if it means dying for those principles, I think a lot of people would have this attitude, right? That death in this situation is a good thing. And in a way, it's very much like this sort of martyr culture that you see, and it doesn't have to be like a real death. It can just be like, you see in social media or in the news, someone says something and they get attacked by one political group or the other, and then they sort of become this martyr for a cause. So I think there's that sort of aspect. If you're willing to take on hardship or even death for a cause that is important to you, then I can kind of see where this sort of death being a good thing can maybe come into play in someone's psyche.
Right. So I hear you say, in some sense, death can be a good thing insofar as there is a moral cause backing it. And in this case, Socrates is the martyr whose death is going to be for the sake of a certain cause, a certain moral cause, perhaps. And we might want to ask, what is that? I think in some sense, he's dying for the sake of virtue, maybe. Just as, I guess, Christ died for man's sins, Socrates is dying for the sake of virtue, perhaps. And I think why I say that is that I think that if he gives in to the jury, to the accusers, and he falsely accepts their charges towards him, that he's a corrupter of the youth and that he's introducing new gods, into the state that are not, the official gods, as it were. He feels like if he bends to the charges of his accusers, he's in some sense compromising his virtue. And so for him to stay steadfast and to not recant his views and to not, sheepishly, I guess, give in to the accusations, and by doing that, he's upholding this standard of virtue. He's embodying this moral model for everybody to imitate. And insofar as we think Socrates is a wise person, insofar as we think that he's a sage who we perhaps might want to model our behavior after, then we might say, okay, well, his steadfast adherence to virtue, despite the cost of his own life, is something that's perhaps admirable, and is something perhaps we want to emulate as well. And that will have no effect if he survives and doesn't die in this instance. If he survives and lives a vicious life, as you pointed out earlier, it's better to die and die virtuously rather than to live viciously. I think this is what we were trying to say, right? And in some sense, this whole passage, I think, is kind of validating that proposition.
Yeah, that's definitely what I was getting from it too, as you were reading it, was that it works in the third proposition we went over, or sorry, second one, works into this third one quite nicely. And yeah, like correct me if I'm wrong, when he's confronted with these charges, he pleads guilty. It's not like he sheepishly shies away from it and says, oh no, I wasn't really doing that, like I was just saying this, and they took it out of context, like please don't hurt me kind of thing.
Yeah.
He's just honest. He says what he believes, and he's ready to take on the consequences for what he believes. So I think that is what makes this in part like a good thing to die for, makes it a good death. It's kind of funny to think about too, because like if you think of the wicked person, like what happens when they die, like it's almost like you want to say the opposite, where it was like, oh, it was a bad thing that they died wicked. They could have died, as a good person. Usually when we think of wicked people dying, we're like, thank God that dude's dead.
Yep.
But in some way it kind of reverses it a little bit.
Yeah, in some sense, right? Especially if that person who's dying, in some sense, was a person, with contradictions. Perhaps they manifested some virtuous aspect, but they also manifested these vicious aspects, and in the end, it was their own vice that was their downfall, that brought about their death. And at their kind of have a sort of empathy for that person or literary figure or a character, because we could see that they were capable of being virtuous, but they weren't, and so we kind of think, well, in situations such as that, if the person, towards the final moments of their life, if they do at least one virtuous act, it's almost like they redeem themselves, right? And you can think of certain maybe literary characters and even real life characters who've done things like that, and it does seem to die virtuously in that sense. Does seem to be able to redeem a vicious person of their actions.
Reminds me of what we went over with Scrooge.
Yes, Scrooge. Yeah, Scrooge. Or I can think of Edmund in Shakespeare's King Lear, who sentences Lear and Cordelia to death, and then at the last, he's like, "Quickly tell the executioner to stop. I've given orders for them to be executed." And then it's too late, of course, at the end, right? Like Cordelia's dead and Lear's there holding her in his arms, and it's tragic, but there's some redeeming moments there, with Edmund's character. And even Edmund says, and I might not be quoting this perfectly, but he says something like, some good I mean to do despite my nature. And so, I think there's within every human being maybe an ability to transcend their nature, their vicious nature, for the sake of maybe their higher nature, their virtuous nature.
We get that with Darth Vader as well.
Yes, Darth. Exactly. Yeah, you hit the nail with the hammer there. Well, we could probably go on and have with an endless list here, but for time's sake, and for the meditations upon death's sake, I think let us progress to our fourth proposition here and our final proposition, and then we can briefly summarize where we've been and where we might be going after this. So, proposition 4: the virtuous man is impervious to harm, either in life or death, and he is looked after by a divine providence. So I'll just briefly preface this passage with some of my own thoughts here. So what I gather from this is that not only is death a good thing for Socrates, but it is also a harmless thing to a virtuous person. A virtuous person cannot be harmed either as he lives or as he dies. Perhaps the virtuous man's imperviousness to harm is partly attributable to a divine providence that buffers him against it. Or as Socrates says, and here's the passage, you too must be a good hope as regards death, gentlemen of the jury, and keep this one truth in mind, that a good man cannot be harmed either in life or in death, and that his affairs are not neglected by the gods. So this passage here is somewhat more short and succinct. I'll just offer my reflections briefly, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this, Ryan. So here's my reflections here. So there is something about a virtuous person that makes them unaffected by forces that inflict bodily or psychological pain. So perhaps those who are virtuous have a greater pain threshold. Maybe they're more resilient. Maybe they are less affected by the anxieties and worries about death as well, and are therefore less psychologically distressed by the facticity of their own mortality. Perhaps they are less harmed by death because they have the right judgments about death. For example, that death is not a bad thing, but perhaps a blessing. Judgments which lead to a reduction of anxiety about death and to an increase in calmer feelings and emotions in relation to death. So that's my own take on this passage. I think it's saying some interesting things, perhaps about human psychology and about the psychology in particular of a virtuous man or a virtuous person who seems to have this imperviousness to harm, either while they're still alive or when they're dying or when they're dead, it would seem. So be curious to hear what you think on this matter there, Ryan.
With regards to harm during, in life, I mean, Epicurus would state that that's sort of the goal of the wise man. That's what they're aiming for, is to avoid harm and to steer themselves towards good and virtue. So, for Epicurus, that it's not just like drinking a bunch and partying. That's not what he means by, like, he doesn't mean pleasure, but he means things like prudence and temperance. So if you're someone who's a virtuous person and you're a prudent person, then you're going to be avoiding sort of like these extremes in life. You're not going to be overindulging in things. You're not going to be avoiding certain things. You're going to be enjoying life in a nice, happy medium. So that I think Epicurus would agree with that assessment for life. And then in death, for him, it's just, death is no harm to us. Like it can't cause us harm in principle. It's just the definition of death for Epicurus.
Right.
The cessation of sensation. So death isn't actually a harm. It's not really a concern for us. It's only the fear of death that really does us harm.
Right. That's an interesting take of it as well. I think that makes a lot of sense to the degree that we never actually experience our death, the event of our death. We experience all the events leading up to it, and perhaps in a state of pain. If we have a terminal cancer, and we're continually in this state of pain, or we're continually medicating ourselves to mitigate that pain. While there might be a degree of pain there's no pain at all at the moment we die, perhaps, because we don't go on to experience that. Insofar as, experience ends with the end of the life of the body, to that degree, we don't experience any distress or anxiety or fear in virtue of death.
Yeah, and I think too, you you touched on this, where leading up to death, as we're dying, it can be painful, and then throughout life, like, we experience hardships that are objectively painful on our nervous system. But I think the wise and the virtuous person is able to, in some sense, transcend that and almost transform it into something. They're able to take, you see a lot of historical figures, one notable psychologist being, Viktor Frankl, talks about this, like using meaning to transform the suffering into something, that allows you to survive and overcome all of these obstacles. And then the other person I was thinking, like someone like Nelson Mandela, someone who is a prisoner of war, but was able to transform all of this into something great. So you can be faced with things that are objectively painful, but I think the wise and the virtuous person has a way of transforming it into something that is objectively good.
Yeah, I think those are some good and valid points you bring up there. There's a few that I wanted to touch on that sort of grabbed my attention. So you had talked about the virtues of temperance and prudence, and the virtuous person is a prudent person insofar as they have the capacity to, I suppose, make wise decisions and prudent decisions, as we would put it. And I think a facet of prudence as well is this sort of conscientiousness, this conscientious mindfulness, kind of watching what you eat, watching your lifestyle habits, making sure you're acting in congruence with your ideals, whether that ideal is, say, to live a healthy life, mentally and physically. The prudent person is one who is able to practice what they preach. They're able to act in alignment with those ideals and their actual mode of behavior in the here and now. And this other virtue of temperance, again, this is these are both classic virtues, prudence and temperance. And temperance is one of, I kind of think of it as sort of like self-regulation, like your capacity to exercise self-control, and therefore, in virtue of exercising self-control, to embody self-efficacy. And it's one of those virtues, that is, I think in some senses, fairly rare to see it manifest, in its fullness. I think so many people, myself included, can be prone to giving into those short-term temptations and satisfying those short-term desires and so on and so forth, rather than to, be able to wisely inhibit them for the sake of a future goal, perhaps for the sake of our, mental health and well-being, perhaps. And this sort of kind of dovetails into what I was sort of talking about as well. There's the virtuous person is impervious to harm to the degree that they have the characteristics that enable them to be impervious to it. So they have the virtuous character. And from that, it follows, they have the ability to make the right judgments about adverse situations that are threatening, and I think there's a lot to be said by the way we judge situations. Two people could be in the same situation, and one could be, paralyzed with fear, and the other one could be, stoically detached. So what's the difference there? Well, it's the difference in some sense, it's a difference of how those people are judging the situation. Because as, according to some theories, judgments give rise to certain emotions, and then these emotions in turn affect our behaviors. And I think there's some truth to that. I think other factors come into play as well, but I think insofar as the cognitive aspect of fear and anxiety goes, a central part of that is the way we judge situations. So there's a lot in there, and we've touched on a lot. I don't want to get bogged down too much in the nitty gritty details. But I know, having examined these remaining propositions, I feel like I feel somewhat more clear on what it is to meditate upon death, and maybe what some of the useful, practical skills we can use to meditate upon death for the sake of our own well-being. Perhaps just before I'm closing too, there's a few points too that you had mentioned that I would like to touch on, specifically from the last passage. The one was also the point you made regarding meaning, and how having pursuits in your life that are meaningful can help, I guess, to some extent, help buffer you against things like the fear of death, or any other types of harms, physical harm or mental harm. And I think there's some truth to that. I think I think Socrates, like you mentioned, Nelson Mandela, and it's a good example. I think Socrates himself is an example, to the degree that you find meaning, I suppose, in the way your acceptance of the inevitability of your death, or the inevitability of human suffering. I think the existential philosophers such as Frankl, I think that's one of the points they make. I think for thinkers like Frankl, I think there's three ways to find meaning, to find and fulfill meaning in your life. I think one of them is through doing a certain deed. One is like the attitude you take towards inevitable suffering, or the inevitable more generally. And I forget what the third point was. I think there's a third one in there too.
Is that like creating works or something like that, like some sort of creative outlet, like?
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, no. I was preparing for this meditation on death, and not a discussion on existential philosophy and psychology. So maybe we'll come back to that at some point, because that's a whole other can of worms. But
I will briefly. So it is creating a work or doing a deed, experiencing something or encountering someone, and then the attitude that we take towards unavoidable suffering.
Okay, there you go. So that clarifies it. Yeah, so there you have it. I think that third point would apply most fittingly to the topic of our current conversation. The unavoidable suffering, I suppose, of death, insofar as death causes suffering. Although if you're an Epicurean, you would probably deny that. So I don't know if I have any definite answers myself as to where I stand with all of this. But I think pragmatically, I think Socrates is providing some good advice, and I think he's providing some good practical, if not theoretical, wisdom. He's providing us with a way of how to think about death, metaphysically, and he's providing us with insights into the epistemology of thinking about death, and drawing to our attention that we don't necessarily know what happens when we die, and so therefore we're not really justified in thinking that it's a bad thing and that it's going to cause all this suffering. And in fact, maybe the contrary is true. At least pragmatically speaking, if we believe that our death might be a blessing, then that's adaptive, that's beneficial in some sense. I think the ethical implications of Socrates' meditation can be useful, providing us with the right attitude towards death, and providing us perhaps with certain precepts that we can internalize, and which we can apply to our own life to better cope with the inevitability of death for the sake of our own well-being in the broad sense, hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being. I think Socrates' musings on death can provide those practical precepts that can help us cope with that inevitability. So, do you have any final thoughts on any of that, Ryan, before I sum things up?
No, I think I'll just let it marinate until our next visit, and yeah, we'll keep moving on with this topic.
Sounds good. Well, in our this current meditation on death, we've looked at the Pythagoreans. We looked at and their thoughts on the nature of death. We looked at Socrates' reflections and meditations on the nature of death at more length, and we examined his meditations on death within the context of the Apology. We examined 4 core propositions that I extracted from that dialogue by Plato, which I think get to the gist of what it means to meditate upon death, or perhaps "gist" is the wrong word, but help to convey, in some sense, what it means to meditate upon death. And the first proposition was regarding born of ignorance and not wisdom. And the second had to deal with that it's not difficult to avoid death when your life is threatened insofar as that it's something you can control, but it's much more difficult to avoid becoming a vicious person as a result of your actions. And then the third proposition we looked at was more having to do with from the source from which we know that death might be a good thing. So for Socrates, it's his daemon, it's his it's his guide, it's his personal deity. And finally, the fourth proposition had to deal with the virtuous person being impervious to harm, and whether they're living or dead. So those are the core propositions we went over, and we've come to some tentative conclusions where we might stand with regards to all of this, whether we think it's a good wisdom or not. And so I hope in future explorations we can sort of delve more deeply into this topic, because I think there's so many other philosophers within the Western, and I suppose even the Eastern philosophical canon, who've also brought forward some pretty interesting insights regarding the meditation upon death. And so I'd be happy to delve into those a bit more deeply as we explore along in our conversations moving forward. So for now, I hope everyone has some things to ponder and meditate about with regards to their own death. So until we meet again, keep pondering.